He handed her a glass of champagne and told the whole ballroom she should stick to her little drawings, because business was for grown-ups. 300 guests laughed with him. What none of them knew was that the woman he'd just humiliated had already redesigned the very hotel they were standing in, under a name nobody in that room could trace, and that her signature, not his father's, not his, was the only reason the Wexford empire still had a roof over its head. Rewind 30 seconds, to the breath right before the room tilted. The gala was called Cypress Point Rising, held inside the newly restored ballroom of the Wexford family's flagship resort on the South Carolina coast. 300 of the wealthiest names on the eastern seaboard dressed in silk and black tie under chandeliers dripping gold light onto marble floors. Julian Wexford stood center stage in a tailored tuxedo, microphone in hand, glowing with the particular confidence of a man who believes the room belongs to him. Beside the dessert table, a woman in a simple emerald dress stood with her hands folded, watching him the way you watch a storm you've already decided not to run from. Her name was Odette. She was his wife. And in exactly 1 minute, this room full of people who had never once bothered to learn her name was going to learn something that would make every one of them rethink every conversation they'd ever had in her presence. Watch the far side of the stage. A woman in a charcoal blazer, an architectural firm's badge clipped to her lapel, is already stepping toward a podium with a folder in her hands. Inside that folder is a name that's about to turn 74-year-old Augustus Wexford's legs to water in front of everyone he's ever tried to impress. Nobody in that ballroom sees her coming. Not the husband basking in applause, not the father counting on a stranger to save him, not the woman in the front row who spent 2 years quietly trying to take Odette's place. Hold on to that laughter, because in the next 60 seconds, it's going to die completely, and the woman they called nothing is about to walk to that microphone and become the only thing that matters in the room. Before we go further, somewhere out there tonight is someone sitting in a room full of people who've laughed at a dream they didn't understand, and don't yet know how wrong they are. If that's ever been you, stay with me to the end. Hit subscribe right now, and let me tell you exactly how a girl from a bayou town in Louisiana ended up owning the empire that raised the man who mocked everything she ever wanted to build. To understand how Odette reached that stage, you have to go back more than 2 decades, to a narrow spit of land outside a town called Belrose, Louisiana, where the roads flooded every spring and the houses stood on stilts like they were bracing for a fight they already knew was coming. Her father, Etienne Fontaine, was a woodworker. Not a hobbyist, a craftsman, the kind whose hands could take a warped, water-damaged plank and coax it back into something worth keeping. He built docks and porches and custom cabinetry for resort developers up and down the coast, work that made other men's properties beautiful while his own home sat with a roof that leaked every time the rain came sideways. Little Odette used to sit at the edge of his job sites in the evenings, watching him measure twice before he ever let a saw touch wood. "Anybody can tear a thing down," he told her once, tucking a carpenter's pencil stub behind her ear the way he wore his own behind his. "Takes no skill at all. Building something that outlasts you, that's the part worth chasing your whole life." She kept that stub like a piece of scripture, years before she owned anything worth calling her own. She was 14 when a collapsed scaffold at a resort renovation site took her father's life. He'd been finishing custom millwork inside a hotel lobby for a company that never once put his name on a plaque, never sent flowers, never said a word beyond a company representative handing her mother an envelope with 2 weeks' severance in it, and calling it generosity. Odette watched that man's car, worth more than the house they lived in, pull away down the gravel road, and she didn't cry. She was already doing arithmetic in her head that she didn't yet have words for. Her grandmother, a broad, unhurried woman everyone in Belrose simply called Mama Odile, raised her the rest of the way, running a kitchen with a gumbo pot that somehow always stretched to feed one more mouth. There was a night a man who'd once cheated Etienne out of 3 weeks' pay showed up at Mama's door, hungry, humiliated, asking for help. Odette wanted the door slammed in his face. Instead, she watched her grandmother sit him down and feed him without one unkind word. After he left, Mama latched the door and said the thing that would live in her granddaughter's blood for the rest of her life. "I fed the man. I never had to forget what he did. Those are 2 different jobs, baby. You'll do both your whole life. Just don't ever let them get tangled up in your heart." Grief could have swallowed the girl whole. Instead, it hardened into a plan. She earned a scholarship to study architecture, working nights cleaning office towers to cover what the scholarship didn't. And in those empty buildings after midnight, she started reading the blueprints and financing documents left behind on desks, teaching herself, quietly and without anyone's permission, exactly how the people who built empires actually held on to them. In one finance elective she nearly didn't have time to attend, a visiting lecturer said something that rearranged her entire understanding of money. Real fortunes aren't built when everyone is buying. They're built in the years everyone is too frightened to. She underlined it twice with the flat edge of her father's pencil stub. At 23, she used every dollar she'd saved cleaning offices and scraping by on scholarship stipends to buy a storm-damaged duplex nobody else wanted. After a loan officer took one look at her second-hand coat and told her to come back once she had real collateral, she fixed the roof herself. She rented it out, borrowed against the equity, bought the next one. She repeated that pattern a dozen times before a single soul outside her own household knew her name. And she made absolutely certain it stayed that way. When the money started becoming real, she buried her name inside it on purpose. A quiet holding company called Fathom Holdings sat behind layers of trusts and nominee directors, and at the front of it all stood a careful, soft-spoken attorney named Walter Cage, who signed the documents and shook the hands while the true owner remained a rumor nobody bothered chasing very hard. "You're the face," she told him the day they built the structure. "I'm the one nobody meets." A financial reporter once spent the better part of 4 months trying to trace the source of Fathom's capital and gave up, writing it off as probably some overseas pension fund. He never once thought to look for a black woman from a flood-prone town in Louisiana with a pencil stub in her pocket. Then the market cracked, the way markets eventually always do, and while panicked investors dumped everything they owned, Fathom Holdings quietly bought distressed boutique hotels along 3 coastlines, historic buildings condemned for demolition that she personally drew up restoration plans for under a pseudonym, small resort chains gasping under debt they could no longer service. She never overpaid. She never rushed. She bought low, held long, and by her early 30s, she quietly controlled a portfolio large enough to purchase her future husband's entire family business, several times over using nothing but the interest sitting untouched in one account. And still, not one relative, not one rival, not one reporter ever traced a single dollar of it back to the girl from Belrose. Which brings us to a roadside diner, 6 years before the night that microphone changed everything. Odette had come back to the Louisiana coast to quietly scout land for a restoration project. Dressed down in worn jeans, no jewelry, nothing about her suggesting she was anyone at all. A man slid into the booth across from her, loosening a tie he clearly despised. His name was Julian Wexford, 29 years old then, 6 years softer than the man he'd eventually become. He'd driven 4 hours just to escape a phone call from his father, who kept him, in Julian's own bitter words, as a backup in case one of my brothers actually amounts to something. She laughed before she could stop herself. He looked at her properly then, and for a moment, forgot entirely to perform. Here's the quiet, cruel irony sitting underneath this whole story. At that exact moment, Odette's holding company already owned the mortgage on 2 failing boutique properties his own family desperately needed to offload. She could have ended his family's financial panic before their coffee even went cold. She said nothing about any of it, because for the first time in her adult life, a man was looking at her like she mattered, while believing completely that she had nothing. After a childhood spent invisible and a fortune deliberately built to stay hidden, that particular kind of unbought attention was something she had never once been allowed to have. So when he asked what she did for a living, she told him a version of the truth dressed in plain clothes. "I restore old buildings," she said. "Mostly ones nobody else wants anymore." He asked if there was real money in that. "Barely any," she smiled, and he believed her completely. They talked until the diner closed around them. He walked her to her truck and told her, almost shyly, about a hotel he wanted to design someday with his own name on the plans instead of his father's. She heard the ache underneath it, the same ache she'd carried her whole life, and something in her that had been sealed shut for 15 years cracked open just slightly. That was the night she started falling, not for the Wexford name, but for a man who wanted to build something his father couldn't take credit for. They married a year later, and for a while it really was good. He'd come home and find her sketching restoration concepts at the kitchen table for buildings she never told him she actually owned. And he'd laugh and pull up a chair beside her, adding his own terrible little doodles in the margins just to make her smile. On quiet Sundays they'd drive nowhere in particular, and call it an adventure, splitting a gas station sandwich like it was a feast fit for royalty. Once, half asleep against the truck window, he told her he'd marry her again, even if they ended up with absolutely nothing between them. She almost told him the truth right then. That nothing was the one thing they would genuinely never have to worry about. She didn't. She held that secret a little longer. The way you hold something warm on a cold night, because she loved, more than she could explain, that he had no idea what she was actually worth. The Wexford family itself was the cold part. She met them properly at a formal dinner where Augustus Wexford didn't so much as rise from his chair to greet her, informing the table, in front of her, that a girl from the bayou dressed up nice was still just swamp water in a crystal glass. The other wives tittered politely, but the man from that diner reached under the table, took her hand, and whispered that he had her, that his father's opinion didn't matter. She believed that too. That was the man she'd married, before fear and a collapsing family empire got their hands on him. Watch how a good man dims. It never happens in one single night. It auditions itself slowly, one small cruelty rehearsed quietly before it's performed in public. The empire had begun cracking 2 years into their marriage. Wexford Hospitality Group's aging resort portfolio bleeding money to newer competitors, debt stacking like storm clouds while the banks began circling. The more his father drowned, the more Julian saw one desperate opportunity to finally be the son who mattered. The first time he used Odette's background as a punchline in public was almost accidental, at a company retreat, joking that she'd never held a proper wine glass before he found her. The table laughed. His father laughed with him for the first time in years instead of at him. Julian felt that laugh land like a drug, and he would spend the rest of the marriage chasing a bigger dose of it every time. That was the season a strategic consultant named Camille Reyes attached herself to Julian's side, smooth and calculating, reading exactly which way the room was leaning and betting accordingly. A charming country wife works when you have nothing to protect, she murmured to him one evening while debt figures glowed red on a laptop screen between them. You can't keep dragging dead weight to your father's table now that everything's actually on the line. Julian stared at those numbers and said nothing back. That silence was the first real brick pulled loose from the man Odette had married. There was a dinner not long after where Odette watched it happen in real time. A hotel developer courting the Wexford family casually asked her opinion on a coastal parcel they were considering, and she, who knew that particular stretch of land, its flood patterns, its soil composition, better than anyone else at that table, began to answer honestly. Julian cut her off with a laugh before she'd finished a sentence. "Baby, stick to your little sketches," he said, steering the table back toward Camille, who repeated a shallower, wronger version of the exact point Odette had been making. The developer nodded along, satisfied. Odette folded her napkin into a smaller and smaller square, and said nothing more that night. But that was the evening the woman who'd fallen for a man in a roadside booth quietly began, piece by piece, to stand back up. Around that same time, Julian discovered, by accident, flipping through a folder left open on her desk, a set of detailed architectural renderings for a full restoration of the family's flagship property, Cypress Point, submitted anonymously months earlier under a small design firm nobody at Wexford Hospitality could quite place. He didn't recognize his own wife's hand in the line work, because he'd never once bothered to actually look closely at her sketches. He laughed about the renderings at a family dinner instead, calling the mystery firm some overpriced boutique nobody's ever heard of trying to play in the big leagues. Entirely unaware he was mocking, line for line, the exact drawings his wife had spent 4 months perfecting at their own kitchen table. It was around then that Mama Odile, back in Belrose, began to fail. Odette flew home every chance she got, sitting for hours in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and old rain, holding the same weathered hands that had once stretched a gumbo pot to feed a stranger who didn't deserve it. She called Julian on the worst night, when the doctors' voices had gone quiet and careful in the specific way doctors' voices go when the news has turned final. She called 9 times. 10. 11. A nurse touched her shoulder gently and asked if there was someone else they should try reaching. Odette looked down at her silent phone and said only, "No, there's no one else." 300 miles away, on a rooftop lounge overlooking the coast, Julian's phone buzzed face down on a bar top while Camille slid her hand over it and pushed it quietly out of view, and he let her. Mama Odile passed that night with her granddaughter's hand in hers, and her son-in-law's absence sitting in the room like its own kind of presence. Odette never told Julian what he had missed. She folded that grief the way her grandmother had once taught her to fold hardship. Small, quiet, carried where no one else could see it. And a week later, she walked past the small drawing studio she kept in a spare room of their house, the one filled with her father's old tools and her own restoration sketches, and closed the door for good. She didn't fall apart. She went to work. And this time, the work had a name attached to it that nobody in that family would ever have guessed. In an unmarked office 2 states away, she sat across from Walter Cage with a binder thick as a brick between them. Inside it was every debt, every crack, every overextended loan currently strangling Wexford Hospitality Group. The arithmetic was cold and simple. 90 days, Walter told her, before the banks moved to seize the whole portfolio and sell it off in pieces to whoever could pay fastest. The obvious buyer is us, he said. We could let it collapse and pick up the assets for a fraction of what it'd cost to rescue the whole thing intact. She turned the pages slowly until she reached the employee rosters. Housekeeping staff, maintenance crews, front desk teams, nearly 4,000 names across the company's remaining properties, many of them families who'd worked those resorts for 2 and 3 generations. Her finger stopped on one line item. The maintenance contractor handling structural repairs at Cypress Point was a small firm still run by men who'd apprenticed, decades earlier, under her own father. "I don't want the pieces," she told Walter. "I want to save the whole thing. Every job stays. One condition: the buyer stays anonymous until the night the deal closes. I want to be in the room when they finally meet the person they've spent months begging to save them. I want to see their faces before they see mine." Walter studied her for a long moment. "This isn't just business anymore, is it?" "It stopped being just business," she said. "The night I made 11 phone calls nobody answered." She uncapped her father's old pencil stub and signed the rescue agreement in soft gray lead. A signature not one soul in the Wexford family would recognize until it was already far too late to matter. 2 weeks later, Cypress Point Rising opened its doors. A black-tie gala thrown specifically to celebrate the resort's stunning, newly finished restoration, and to formally welcome whatever mystery investor had agreed to save the family from 90 days of financial ruin. Word had moved quietly through the crowd that the anonymous benefactor was somewhere inside that very ballroom tonight. Augustus Wexford worked the floor like a drowning man passing out life vests he didn't actually have, gripping the hands of senators, bankers, strangers he mistook for someone important, rehearsing his gratitude speech in a hallway mirror before he ever came downstairs. He hunted that mystery buyer through the entire glittering crowd, and never once glanced toward the woman in the emerald dress standing quietly by the dessert table. The same woman who'd redesigned the very ballroom he was standing in. Julian took the stage a little past 10, riding high on champagne, and the certainty that the deal was as good as signed. His father's mood warmer toward him than it had been in over a year. A man feeling that good, holding a live microphone, rarely knows how to leave well enough alone. He tapped it twice, grinned out at the crowd, and reached for the joke he'd been perfecting for months. "Y'all have been so good to my family tonight," he said, gesturing down toward Odette with easy, careless affection. "Let me introduce my wife properly." Found her sketching little house plans on a napkin down in some bayou town nobody's heard of. Sweetest thing. Still thinks she's going to be an architect one day. The room laughed warmly. "I keep telling her, baby, leave the real building to the grown-ups." The ballroom roared with laughter. Augustus laughed loudest of all. Camille, seated at the front table, raised her champagne flute in a slow, glittering toast toward Odette, savoring every second of it. And on the far side of the stage, a woman in a charcoal blazer stepped toward a second microphone, a folder held carefully in both hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called out, her voice cutting cleanly through the fading laughter. "The Wexford family asked me to share some extraordinary news tonight. The firm behind Cypress Point's full architectural restoration. the design that saved this flagship property, and as of 3 days ago, the entire Wexford portfolio, through a rescue agreement with its principal investor, has agreed to be named publicly for the very first time. Augustus straightened at the podium, glowing, ready at last to bow toward whoever had finally saved him. The design and the investment, the woman continued, opening the folder, come from the same source. Please welcome the founder of O. Marchand Design Group and the sole principal behind Fathom Holdings. Her eyes caught the signature at the bottom of the page, soft gray lead pressed into white paper, and her voice caught with it. Signed Odette Wexford. For one full heartbeat, absolutely nothing moved. The first person in that ballroom to understand what had just happened was Camille. You could watch the arithmetic finish itself behind her eyes. The plain dresses, the diner story Julian used to tell as a joke, the sketches she'd once mocked as amateur, all of it slamming into place a full second before anyone else caught up. Her champagne flute tipped in her hand. A single drop hit the tablecloth, and her face moved from cold amusement straight into something closer to panic, already calculating not how this could possibly be true, but how quickly she could get out of that room clean. At the family table, the laughter curdled in stages. Julian's brothers, Foster and Reed, exchanged a look that had nothing to do with confusion, and everything to do with sudden, sharp calculation. And Augustus's face was the one worth watching most, because for months he had begged a stranger for mercy, and now he understood the stranger had been sitting at his own holiday table for 6 years, passing the rolls, saying nothing, while he called her swamp water in a crystal glass. The room detonated. Not into silence, but into a different kind of roar entirely, 300 phones lifting at once. On the enormous screen above the stage, the camera found Julian's face at the exact moment his own joke curved back around and pointed directly at him. That has to be a mistake," he stammered into the microphone, his voice shaking loud enough for every speaker in the building to carry it. "Odette doesn't, she can't possibly." She rose without hurrying, crossed the stage, and gently slipped the microphone from his trembling hand. When she finally spoke, she never once raised her voice, and that was exactly what made it unbearable to listen to. "You're right that I came from nothing," she said, looking directly at him. "My father built docks and cabinetry for resorts just like this one. He died on a scaffold at a job site almost identical to this property, and the company he built it for never once put his name on anything." She let the silence hold. Fathom Holdings owns the debt that was about to bury this entire company. Every job stays. Every family keeps their home. I didn't do that for the name Wexford. I did it because 4,000 people shouldn't lose everything for one family's pride. Her eyes found Augustus in the crowd. That part was never in question. The marriage was the only thing I hadn't decided yet. Augustus Wexford, 74 years old and 30 years into building a name he'd guarded jealously his entire life, walked unsteadily to the front of the stage and went down onto one knee, then both, in front of the daughter-in-law he had dismissed at his own dinner table for 6 straight years. The microphone on its stand caught his whisper and threw it across the entire ballroom. "Forgive an old fool, girl. I never once saw you. God help me, I never saw you." She looked down at him, and there was no triumph in her expression at all. Only something older and far more tired than triumph. Then she turned back toward her husband and dropped her voice to something almost private, though the microphone betrayed her one final time, carrying every word. "You want to know the exact night I stopped being your wife?" She pressed a hand flat against her own chest. "It was a hospital room 8 months ago. I called you 11 times. You didn't answer because you were somewhere else, with someone else." She didn't look at Camille. She wouldn't give her the satisfaction. "My grandmother died that night, Julian, holding my hand instead of yours, because you weren't there to hold either of ours. I saved your family's entire company today. I couldn't save that. And there isn't enough money in this whole ballroom to buy it back." The room that had roared and gasped and applauded finally found the one silence it never wanted, the ashamed kind. She set the microphone back on its stand, stepped down past her kneeling father-in-law and her frozen husband, and walked toward the doors. A young valet, barely out of his teens, pulled the heavy door open for her without being asked, the exact way someone's grandmother might have raised him to. She stopped, looked at him like he was the only genuine person left in the entire building, and said the only 2 words she offered anyone on her way out. "Thank you." Then she walked into the dark, and the doors closed quietly behind her. The days that followed didn't resolve the way stories like to promise, with every wrongdoer receiving precisely what they'd earned. Some of it landed hard. Some of it walked away untouched. That's simply how it tends to go in real life. By sunrise, the footage was everywhere. Julian at that microphone, calling his own wife a charity case who should stick to her little sketches, racking up millions of views before the ballroom candles had even gone cold. He attempted, for about a day, to get ahead of it with a stiffly worded apology video about a private matter between husband and wife. It made everything considerably worse. The internet had already heard about the 11 unanswered phone calls, and it was not inclined toward mercy. 3 days later, the Wexford board convened, and there was nothing left to debate, because the woman whose signature had saved the company held every meaningful card, and the man caught on that recording held none. The vote moved quickly. "We're Wexford's, Julian," Foster told him, not quite meeting his eyes. "We go where the payroll still clears." His own brothers voted against him without hesitation. Julian stood outside on the sidewalk afterward, where a valet who used to sprint to fetch his car now looked straight through him, and he finally understood, far too late, exactly what he'd traded everything for. The applause he'd spent his whole adult life chasing had never once been love. It had only ever been noise. There was one final private moment between them. He came to her office weeks later, smaller than anyone had ever seen him, and she offered him the only thing she still genuinely wanted. "Say you're sorry," she told him quietly, for the phone. He stood there a long moment, pride wrestling grief, and pride won the way it always had with him. "I'm not about to grovel just because it turns out you're rich," he said and walked out. That refusal became both his punishment and his final cruelty, because it meant the wound she'd named on that stage would never get the apology it actually needed. Camille didn't fall at all. She was gone from the wreckage before the ink dried on the board's decision. Caught briefly by a reporter on the hotel steps, not even slowing her stride. "I consult," she said simply. "I don't marry my clients." She slid into a car and vanished, and no headline ever stuck to her name. No court ever called for her, and her heels never once scuffed. It wasn't fair. It was never going to be fair. This story won't pretend otherwise. The workers were the ones who got the ending that actually mattered. Word moved through the housekeeping halls and maintenance crews and front desks that the quiet woman the family had laughed at was the entire reason their paychecks would keep clearing. A shift supervisor pinned the news to a breakroom bulletin board, and grown men who'd spent months lying awake dreading layoff notices read it twice, then stepped into the parking lot to call their families and say the house was safe. Augustus was the strange, unresolved figure in all of it. He signed over what needed signing, kept every promise Odette had made to the staff, and came to her office once more, hat literally in his hands, looking 10 years older in the span of 3 weeks. He asked, quietly, whether an old fool could ever be considered family again. "I forgive you," she told him, and meant it, because her grandmother had taught her that carrying a grudge only lets someone else live rent-free inside your head. "But forgiving you isn't the same as making you my father. Mine died building someone else's dream, and was never once thanked for it. You don't get to become him now." He nodded, accepted what he'd been given, which was already more than he had any right to expect, and left with his dignity intact and nothing else. Of everything that came to her in the months that followed, the headlines, the sudden respect, the apology she never once demanded, there was only one thing she kept displayed on her office desk. A plain, handwritten card in simple block letters, 4 words long. "Thank you for seeing us." Signed, the Cypress Point night crew. She had spent her entire life feeling unseen. She understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what it meant to finally be the one who saw somebody else clearly. She went home eventually. Of course she did. Back to Belrose. To the narrow spit of land where her father's leaning house had once stood before the water finally took what was left of it. She bought the property outright, along with the surrounding acres, and this time she built something square, small and honest, finished true on every side, including the sides no visitor would ever see, because her father had taught her that the part nobody sees is the part that tells the truth about who you really are. Over the doorway, she mounted a plain wooden plaque with his name cut deep into solid oak, his name finally fixed to a wall that no wealthy family could ever tear down. She hired the same small maintenance crew that had once worked under her father decades earlier to help build it, men who still remembered the shape of his hands on a length of cypress wood. One of them, an older craftsman named Booker who'd framed houses beside Etienne 30 years before, set down his tools and simply stared at her for a long moment. "Lord," he finally said, removing his cap. "You've got his eyes. His hands too, I'd bet." She smiled, maybe her first real one in over a year. "He taught me everything I know about building things that last." Booker looked up at the plaque, at her father's name carved into the wood, and his eyes went wet. "He never would have believed this," he said softly. "He would have believed it," she answered. "He just never would have bragged about it." The morning the little house was finished, she stood alone on the front step and took out the worn pencil stub her father had tucked behind her ear when she was 9 years old. The same stub that had signed the deal quietly, saving an entire company nobody knew she owned. She knelt in the soft earth by the doorway and pressed it gently into the ground, tip first, like planting something meant to grow, like laying down a small, private marker over everything she'd loved and lost and finally rebuilt. She rested her palm on the fresh soil for a moment, and then softly on her own chest, right over her heart. She had fed every face that once fed her, and lifted every one of them in return. The old crews, the housekeeping staff, the strangers who'd never learned her real name. She never once tried to destroy the people who'd laughed at her while she was down. She simply stopped, at last, letting forgiveness and memory tangle together in her heart, exactly the way an old woman had once taught her in a kitchen that always somehow stretched far enough. So the next time you find yourself sizing someone up by their shoes, their hometown, their quiet way of speaking, or the modest dream they're carrying around in a sketchbook, don't. You have no idea whose father built the very floor you're standing on, or whose dream is the only thing keeping your own world standing upright. She walked into her new house, and the door beneath her father's carved name stayed open behind her, warm light spilling out over the step and onto the small pencil stub buried in the soft dirt below it.
If her stillness said something to you tonight, don't keep it to yourself. Somebody watching this right now feels invisible, feels laughed at, feels counted out of their own life story. Send this to them. Like the video, subscribe if this is your first time here, and tell me in the comments, was Augustus on his knees enough for you? Or did Julian walk away far too easy? I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next story.